The exhibition started in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro and then in São Paulo, and it's come here. But there's a real sense that between South Africa and South America, there are points of contact, of not the same history, but elements of the histories that are the same, a distance from what is seen as the center of the art worlds in Europe or North America. And so the need to find a local world that still can resonate outside. Fortuna in the title refers to a very specific kind of process. You have a kind of art making which is like John Cage, where you throw the I Ching, where it's about chance. You say, let randomness just show me what the work should be. Or you can work with a program, saying, a Leninist program, saying, these are the images needed in the world. This is what someone needs to understand. This is what I will teach them. Here is the essay, and having written the essay, I can now make the artwork. And it's not that either. So it's not chance, and it's not a program. So the films don't have a script or a storyboard. But it's saying if you start working with an image or the start of a work and are open to what it suggests, that's when the real breakthroughs will happen. So that is the Fortuna. That's the good fortune, which is both something inside you, like these photographs of the sharpful, which somewhere were sitting inside me, but I wasn't starting with them as the program, nor was it a random image that came from nowhere. So it has to do with understanding there are all sorts of ways we construct the world from things inside us and being open to meeting those. What we wanted to try to get some sense of was the excess in the studio, the too muchness. That there are always different projects, and the way one project will infect another. A drawing will come into a piece of theatre, which will come into a piece of sculpture. And so it was in both of the two rooms, to have a room of too many different styles, too many different ways of working to show that excess. So that was the idea to put sculpture together with the prints, together with the drawings in the same room as the films and the stereoscope drawings. In previous exhibition, they've been quite politely sectioned into different smaller rooms. So that was the thematic difference. The starting point is always the work in the studio. And from the work in the studio, a series of possible meanings emerge. So even the themes would be given to some extent by the material. So, for example, in the animation, the erasure of the charcoal marks is very imperfect. So there's always a ghost of what had happened on the paper before. And this is not an intention, this is what the medium makes of itself. But what it means is that a sense of historical time, of memory, of trace of events, of a record of something that's past is there in the material. So these questions of memory and not holding on to memory comes from the work. So the themes come from the work rather than the themes imposing themselves before the work is made. There's the Méliès films, which are on the third floor, which are a homage to Georges Méliès, the very early filmmaker. And they came from seeing some of his films and realizing a very close sensibility and remaking some films of Georges Méliès. But there's also a way in which the early history of cinema, or the prehistory, the machines which existed before cinema, like a phenakistoscope, which is on exhibition, or stereoscope drawings, or anamorphic projections, are all parts of a kind of several things. One of kind of performances of transformation. taking two flat images and transforming them into the illusion of depth in a stereoscope, taking the still frames of a movie and giving the illusion of movement when you project them quickly. And in each of these cases, one is aware of the work that we do to make sense of the image. You know, when you watch a movie that you're watching still images projected in front of your eyes, and we believe we know we're doing two things. We're not fools. We believe in the moving image in front of us, but we know that the moving image is made up out of still images. So we step behind ourselves and understand ourselves as this astonishing the pleasures of self-deception. That we know what we're seeing is false. We're not seeing movement, we're seeing still images, but we take pleasure in the way we deceive ourselves that it is in movement. Or we know we're looking at two still photographs, two flat photographs, but when we look at them in a stereoscope, we believe we're seeing depth. So what that demonstrates in the studio and in the museum is the way in which we construct sense of the world, here in visual terms of movement, of depth, but also in the broader question of how we make sense of the world from all the fragments that come in. So the films, which don't really have stories, operate like we would operate in the world, with different fragments coming to us, from which we construct a kind of coherent self. So when we go out every morning, we can talk, we can understand things, people know who we are, but every day it's a construction. And sometimes it's an exhausting construction. Sometimes you have to gird yourself to put on a smile, to go through the world when inside you're disintegrating. So it's not such a foreign sensation either. I think through seeing the Georges Méliès films, which are made by a theatre person and an artist who would paint backdrops and step into those frames himself. So I think it was from that. And then you think back of other artists in their own drawings or films, and you realize you've got all the way back to Courbet and his image of the artist in the studio. And then you think of Jackson Pollock, the films of Jackson Pollock painting where he is kind of the brush. And then of Bruce Nauman in his studio where he's the brush and the canvas. So there's a kind of also has a conversation, a lot of the work has a conversation with earlier work by other artists in this field. The sound is a vital part of the films, not just in the obvious way of making the mood of the film, sad music, happy music, but in doing two other things. The one is to make the grammar of the films. Here, this causes that, this comes before that, this is the cause of, this is the reason for something else. So a kind of a comma, a full stop, a grammar. But also, more importantly, with listening to different pieces of music, one sees the image differently. So sometimes there'll be a piece of animation that's very jerky, that seems too rough to watch. If you just watch it by itself, your eyes can't follow the movement. But if one finds the right piece of music, suddenly you believe it's smoother, it's faster. So it actually changes how your eye and your mind works. But then it's also it's very much part of the construction of the narrative. So at a very early stage, when a film is quite early in the beginning, I'll work with either the composer or with looking to many different kinds of found music. And the film will take many months to make. So when there are just a few scenes, there will already be some sense of what the sound could be. And as the film develops, that sound gets closer and the film gets closer. So they develop together, and there's an oscillation, a movement backwards and forwards between the sound and the image. So they're very constructed over the 8 months or year of making the film. I was making charcoal drawings and having exhibitions, and thought to get away from what I was doing, I would work on a project that had nothing to do with an exhibition, that would not be seen in a gallery, that didn't have to make any sense to anyone else, that could be made for my own private enjoyment. And that's how the first animated film started. And the characters, Soho and Felix, the two characters in the films, came from dreams months before. There was very strange dreams, and I'd written down their names. And the films were made with no expectation they would ever be seen. The first films, the first 3 films. After that, they were seen on exhibitions, and I understood they would continue, but they were done as a kind of anti-art exercise. In the late 80s when they were made, certainly in South Africa, an exhibition meant oil painting on canvas and at the most drawings, but a film would go to a film festival or be in a cinema, it wouldn't be in a gallery. And it took me a long time to understand again that what I was making was also part of my drawings, and other people had to put them on exhibition, and I tried to stop them. I said, I was insulted. I said, this is not art. This is not art. This should be in a, what are you doing putting it on? And I tried to stop them putting the films on an exhibition. And only when they were up, I thought, oh, all right. Okay, now I've learned what they should be. And I'm very happy at this exhibition for other people to have designed it and put things together. And the designer of the exhibition showed me 2 of the pieces which I've never seen next to each other, have never thought of showing in this way. And now, 20 years after making the piece, I think this is obvious, of course. They should always be shown this way. Who is the idiot who didn't let them be shown this way before? So I think I have a very strong belief, just from personal experience, of being taught by what you have made rather than thinking you can tell it what to do. You can think of a 2-dimensional drawing, a charcoal drawing, as a drawing in 2 dimensions. And you can think of that 2 dimensions plus time being a film, so it's like drawing in 3 dimensions. And then in front of the film you can have performers performing, and then you have a drawing in 4 dimensions. So even though it becomes a piece of theater and it's not just in a museum, it's still a kind of drawing. And it still works on the principle of working from the material outwards, of discovering how, starts from uncertainty rather than a clear program. So it doesn't, I know you see one in a theater and one in a museum, but they don't feel fundamentally different. So the performance piece that happens here in Bogotá, Ubu and the Truth Commission, obviously it's different. It's many actors, it's different kinds of collaborations. But for me, the piece that's here, Ubu Tells the Truth, which comes from the theater piece, I don't think, well, this is the primary and this is the secondary. It feels a very fluid movement. What ended as a theater project, Ubu Tells the Truth, started as a series of etchings which are in the gallery here. And the etchings became an animation which became a piece of theater. I wanted to be an actor at one point, and I failed at this. I went to theater school where I learned very quickly I should not be an actor, because whatever the actor did, whatever role I tried to do, the performance was always the same. But if I only have to perform myself in these films, then that's a safe terrain. So it's an actor who only has one sentence to say forever. I've done a lot of work with puppets over the years, but it started when I'd seen the work by a puppet company, Handspring, who do the puppets, part of the collaborators on Ibu. And they'd seen my animated films, and we said, what happens if we smash the 2 together? Thinking that puppets are a very artificial way of having an actor, and the animation is a very artificial way of drawing the world compared to filming it. So the artificiality, the anti-naturalism of the 2 felt a good meeting point. In 1960, there was a massacre by the police of protesters in a small town called Sharpeville. And in 1961, there was an inquiry into this massacre, and my father was one of the lawyers for the families. And so as a 6-year-old, I remember once going into his office and thinking I was opening a box of chocolates, but in fact it was a box of Kodak film of all these photographs of people with their heads blown off and their chests blown out. Very, very shocking images for a 6-year-old to see, who's first time to see these images of violence. But then I forgot about them for years, for decades. And I finished making one of the films which is here called Felix in Exile, which has a lot of images of bodies lying in the veld, victims of gunshots. But it was only maybe months after finishing the film that I remembered the films that I've seen. So it's They were obviously vital in sitting inside me as these horrific images, but I certainly didn't start from them thinking I have to make a film of those images. It was rather when I saw more recent police photographs, I thought I have to draw those, and later on discovered that in fact I'd been drawing this childhood experience. So I think those early shocks when one understands how the world is made are fundamental, but they also have to percolate through in an indirect way. So the best way for me to have used those photos was to have forgotten about them for 20 years and not know what I was doing. In the same way almost with Ubu and the Truth Commission, we didn't know we didn't think we were making a piece that would have echoes outside of South Africa. And maybe because our focus was so happy to be so in the moment, that it does have a touch that people can feel. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that was looking at responsibilities of perpetrators and the evidence of victims under apartheid. And we understand with the troubled histories, whether it's in Argentina or Brazil or Colombia, of coming to terms with recent historical past, whether it's the siege around the Palace of Justice in 1985 or the disappeared in Argentina. They're questions of a fractured recent history. There are some pieces of art that can galvanize population to arms, to action, but I'm interested in the way we construct ourselves. And if you think of your own or our own way we became who we are, there are certain vital books, certain vital pieces of music, songs, poems, conversations, through which we construct ourselves. And what they have to do is with the recognition in ourselves of something that gets confirmed by the art piece. And I think it's in that sense of raising questions which suddenly echo with something someone already knew. So when I was reading, for example, Italo Svevo, writing in Italy in Trieste in 1926, how can this man writing in Italy in 1920s know what it feels like to be in Johannesburg, 18 years old in 1970? It's that point of contact with a sense of the other, of a sense of a community, of understanding of the world, of how we construct our sense of the world, that for me is the vital part. For me, the thing that art can do, whether it's films or music or drawing, is make an important polemic and space for uncertainty, for not having completely clear endings. All completely clear endings in the end become authoritarian and need to be defended to the hilt. So I think if people understand the plurality of voices that exist, and each time they say, this is what the world is, instead of understanding this is the way I construct my understanding of the world, I think that's the way, and it's an indirect way, that art has a vital role to play. Even in theatre pieces which have as their subject, like Ubu and the Truth Commission, it's not as if I expect the piece directly to have an instrumental, transformative role in the piece process itself, but I think it can have a very strong showing of a communality of understanding in different continents, in different people, and understanding that problems which one thinks of as being so local, not that they're universal, but that similar local things exist in many places. And it's that communality of local understanding that becomes a very powerful thing. It's so strange with Ubu, which is a very specific piece about South Africa. When we first showed it in Europe, in Weimar, they said, well, I understand this is a South African piece and it's not going to make sense to anyone else in Europe, but here in Weimar, it's fantastic because we're opening the files about the Stasi and people are looking at their police files. So for us, this is perfect. And then we went from Germany to Switzerland, where they said, well, it's not going to make sense anywhere else in Europe, but here we were talking about Nazi gold and closing up the Swiss bank accounts and who can see what. For us, it's perfect. And each place we went, in fact, we found there was some local story. In France, it was about collaborators. All over, there was a very strong recognition. In terms of giving comfort to victims, that's much more complicated, because then it's so much the specificness of a trauma. And for some of the victims, it was very cathartic for them to be part of the process. But questions, for example, of reconciliation or forgiveness really need to come from the victims towards other people. So the play we did is Ubu and the Truth Commission, not Ubu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's a much more complicated and difficult question. I think the question of forgiveness is very, very hard, because in fact it's, psychoanalysts say it doesn't happen. You can forgive for a while, but it transforms itself into a different neurosis and will come back. And you only forgive someone when it doesn't matter anymore. But while it's still painful, so I wouldn't presume to, or certainly to speak on behalf of victims, never having been a victim of that nature. It would be presumptuous to do it. But the ironies of what the Truth Commission was, of the pact with the devil, was the heart of the play we were making. It's more difficult. One of the ironies of during the cultural boycott of South Africa, because there was no expectation of being part of a wide conversation, there was a real intensity of an internal conversation. Now that gets much diluted by work being seen all over the world, by musicians traveling. It's harder to find a local voice. There was during the last years of apartheid, there was a kind of a heightened pressure on some of the arts, because there were things you could say in theatre that you couldn't say in newspapers or on television. So there was a way in which they had a vital, informative process, which does not exist now. There was also a way in which they could become a kind of utopian model of how South Africa could be, in the sense that in a very segregated society, there were very many mixed small-scale theatre groups, which kind of drew from the experiences of white actors, of black actors, to bring them together, and had a kind of utopian element as well as the piece of theatre on the stage in front of you. That also no longer has the same power that it would have had before. So in some ways for theatre it's more difficult, for new theatre. Art was always marginal, and it still is marginal, so there's very little state support for the arts in South Africa. But there's always been a way in which the contradictions in the society, the abnormalities of it, were so palpable that there was such rich terrain for artists, writers, filmmakers to work with. And that still stays there. There's the absurdities, the contradictions of the society are slightly different, but still extremely strong and powerful as engines for work to happen. And in some ways a lot of things have transformed after apartheid, but some things are very much the same. It feels a rich place, a lively place to work as an artist still, 20 years after the end of apartheid. Lopez worked with me on and off during the last year as part of the Rolex Mentor Protégé program. One of the reasons of choosing to work with Matteo was that I was astonished at his precision and exactness, in other words, qualities that were the opposite of mine. So I hoped to learn from him how these, and when he started, he has an astonishing skill. Everybody in the studio would come and watch him cutting or drawing. But it was also, I thought that there was things that he could learn from ways of constructing images. He seemed to me just at the right point, someone who was on his own. He was making a name, a career, finding his voice, but that before the voice was fixed, there were extra sounds that could come out of it. So we had a very good period of making animation together, showing him various techniques to work in the studio. And very nice to see his exhibition in New York, which is on at the moment, and to meet up with him again here and to go to his studio in Bogotá. He's also, when I was at theatre school in Paris 30 years ago, I did a lot of work with a Colombian theatre person who I meet again here, Rolf Abderhalden from Mapa Teatro. So that's a kind of so there are also, apart from historical or political connections across the period, there are also these personal connections. And then, of course, the very strong connections to an imagined Colombia through the writings of Marquez.